you. Hello. So I'm Perrine. I'm going to talk to you all about living hyphenated, right? So I have a question. Actually, Dana tapped on this a little bit earlier. Who are you? So when I ask you who you are, more specifically, what defines you? Is it your name? Is it where you're from? Is it your education level, how smart you are? Is it how beautiful you are, your appearance? Who are you? When I think about all of those indicators about my identity, it all points to one thing, mainly one thing, and that's my culture. So I am a first-generation American, but here's a picture of my family, right? We're a completely normal American family. As you can see, that's just an album cover. My father played the musical Saw. I'm sitting on my mom's lap. Completely normal, right? We look so American. We're looking at my brother and I in matching turtlenecks, super 90s. Like you can't get more 90s American family than the matching turtlenecks and the acid wash jeans. We look so American and normal, right? Yeah. So like I mentioned before, I'm a first-generation American, and specifically what that means is that it's someone who is born and or raised in America by immigrant parents. So more specifically, I am Liberian American. So your next question probably is, what is a Liberian? What does that mean, Perrine? So my entire life, I always felt like I was that hyphen. I felt like I was that thing in the middle, kind of holding the two different cultures together. So I'd go home and I'd eat rice and I'd talk to my family about our million cousins and dive into our culture. And then I would go to school and I'd be your average TRL watching 106 in Park voting teenager. But it was almost as if I was living somewhat of like a double life. So again, Liberia, what is Liberia, Perrine? Where is Liberia, Perrine? Liberia is on the west coast of Africa. Africa, everyone, is actually a continent, okay? So I know it's a big misconception. It's this whole thing. It's actually a continent. It actually is composed of 54 countries, and there's over 2,000 languages and dialects spoken in the continent of Africa, yes, yes, yes. Liberia specifically was actually colonized by free Black American slaves, so there's a huge tie to America. If you look at the flag right here, the Liberian flag, it looks very much so, very similar, right, to the American flag. And again, the colonization, the civilization connection to America has a huge deal with that. So when you think about Liberia, if you've been watching the news recently over the past few years, you may have seen that the Ebola crisis that went on, Ebola was a deadly virus that ran rampant throughout various African countries. We saw that took place in Liberia and other West African countries, and we saw kind of how the media depicted that, right? We saw Liberia kind of perceived as a third world country. And so for me, that was always very interesting because my family and our perception of Liberia is this. So I was just like, yeah, all my friends are talking about, oh, is your family okay? And yes, my family was affected by Ebola, but when I think about Liberia, I think about the palm trees, I think about the waves that are perfect for surfing. I think about the ocean. I think about the rich culture and heritage that it has. So there's always somewhat of a disconnect. And so when I finally kind of came of age and really realized like the different things that really kind of made my culture what it was, or how I differentiated and came to terms with my culture, there were a few different things I pointed out, right? So a rice cooker. I have a rice cooker. My mom has a rice cooker. My aunt has a rice cooker. My uncle has a rice cooker. We all have rice cookers, right? Small ones, big ones, medium. We love rice. It's a thing. And so also my mother's accent, very strong, still holding strong since she moved here in 1980. I have a ton of cousins. I mentioned that before. Like a lot of cousins, you guys. Like I could literally not count how many cousins I have. I also thought about how, the food has a very strong smell. When Liberian food is cooked, it's amazing, it's delicious, but it has a very strong smell, guys. My parents would actually cook the food, and when we'd be at home, I would remember my cousins like running outside before we would go out to like the movies or to like a friend's house, and them like spraying and downing themselves with like Bath and Body Works. And it was just a thing. And so I also just thought about how my Black experience was very different from my friend's Black experience. And that's not to say that every Black experience is the same, because it's very, very diverse. It's a very wide spectrum. But I just thought about how, growing up, with my family, it was just very different. I thought about how I saw uncles, I saw cousins after graduating from high school get deported. I thought about how that affected me and my perspective. I thought about just how I would have to explain a lot of things to my mom growing up. Let's say I'd go to a football game and I'm cheering in the football game, and she's like calling and blowing up my cell phone like, "Why aren't you here? It's 8 o'clock. I'm like, "Well, Mom, kickoff starts at 7:30. We're actually still about to hit like fourth quarter." There's just like a lot of different things that I really had to explain to her growing up that she just wasn't familiar with. But when you look at all of these different items that are indicators of my culture, they're all surrounded by that one thing in the middle: the American dream. So the American dream is what my mother and father, they fought for. They came to this country with a better outlook, a different outlook, to give us a better life. And so for them, they wanted to make sure that we could capitalize on a better life. They had to escape from the war of Liberia. So when I mentioned before about how America and Liberia have a lot of similarities, and I talked about how the freed Black American slaves came over to Liberia and colonized it, later down in history, there was a huge civil war that took place. So the civil war took place between those, actual indigenous people in Liberia and those who came and civilized and colonized Liberia. That civil war lasted in Liberia for decades. This is why my parents came here in 1980 to escape that war. And again, the American dream. All right, so when I also just reflect on my culture and I think about like my roots and I think about like what it means, what the American dream just like means to me, it always comes back to my father. So my father was the Dean of Agriculture in the University of Liberia. When he came to America, he became a professor at North Carolina A&T State University. Go Aggies. Oh snap, we're here. We're here. And so I think about all the legacy that my father had, and I think about the legacy that my family had within the Liberia community, and how I kind of bared that weight, and I bared that, I guess, kind of pressure of what they fought for and brought us here for, and how I use that as a driver to push me forward. So, reciting a little bit with my roots. So I actually have a podcast. It's called First Gens. No surprise. I guess you can understand the name. It's about being a first-generation American, and the great thing about the podcast is that we speak to a ton of other first-generation Americans from different countries. We share their experiences, their stories, and allow for their stories to be told to show that being an American isn't always so black and white. So my last question for you kind of rounds back to the first question. Who are you? What are you filling in the blanks with your identity? What are you utilizing as your hyphen? What's your connector? Thank you.